Nobody toppled this empire with a sword, and nobody burned it down with a torch. It was taken apart with a law. Most history counts the battles. This channel reads the contracts. You've been told Charlemagne's empire just fell apart. His sons fought, the Vikings came, the center broke. And that version of the story is true as far as it goes. It's just far too small. The real weapon was Frankish Partible inheritance, a legal custom built for chieftains splitting up cattle and fort hills. And in 843, it got applied to an empire that ran from the Atlantic all the way to the Elbe. The lawyers were ready for it. The parchment was drawn up, the seals were stamped. The Treaty of Verdun gets repeated as a peace agreement, but what it really was an estate planning contract written at the scale of a whole civilization. Nobody conquered this empire. They inherited it, and inheriting it broke it into pieces. By the time we're done here, you'll never look at a succession settlement the same again, because the lawyers were always in the room. Here's how they worked. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. Check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. And now, our story. To understand what the lawyers were dividing, you first have to understand what Charlemagne had actually built. And I don't mean the legend of it. I mean the real system he ran. By the year 800, the Carolingian Empire covered most of the Western and Central Europe. That's modern France, modern Germany, northern Italy, most of Belgium and the Netherlands, and even parts of Spain. Something like 1.1 million square kilometers. And it was governed from a court that never stopped moving, because the king himself had to be physically present to enforce his own authority. There were no ministries, no permanent bureaucracy, no standing civil service of any kind. What there were counts, regional administrators the king appointed directly, each one responsible for taxes and justice, and pulling together an army within his territory. And there were the missi dominici, royal inspectors sent out in pairs to audit those counts, report back to the center, and keep the whole system from drifting. And the thing that held it all together was loyalty, personal loyalty, oaths sworn on relics, renewed face to face, reinforced with land grants and gifts and appointments. It was genuinely sophisticated machine. Einhard, who served at Charlemagne's court and wrote his biography a few years later after he died, describes exactly this. A government that was really just an extension of one man's household, run through the people physically standing around him. Now, you have to read Einhard knowing he adored his subject, and was polishing the legend the whole time. But even in that admiring account, the fragility is obvious. The machine had no engine of its own. It ran on the king. And that was the one fatal flaw built into it, because the whole thing was held together by a single man. Charlemagne wasn't just the political center of the empire, he was the legal center too. Every title, every land grant, every administrative appointment ran through him personally. And the Franks had a law about what happened when the man at the center died. They called it partible inheritance, and it meant you divide the estate equally among the surviving sons. For a Frankish chieftain back in the 5th or 6th century, that made perfect sense. You had a hill fort, some farmland, a few hundred warriors pledged to your family, and you split it among your sons. Each son got a piece. The family kept its grip on the region. Nobody got cut off, and the system held together. Charlemagne understood, better than anyone alive, what would happen when you took that same logic and applied it to an empire. By 806, Charlemagne was an old man, somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s, depending on which birth year you trust. He had 3 legitimate sons, Pepin, Charles the Younger, and Louis, and he'd already buried sons before, so he knew exactly how brutal the arithmetic could get. So he issued a document called the Divisio Regnorum, the Division of Kingdoms, and it was meticulous. It carved the empire into 3 blocks, and they weren't equal slices so much as administrative units, each one designed to function on its own, with defensible borders, a tax base, key monasteries and bishoprics, and the infrastructure to actually govern. The document even anticipated the disputes. There were clauses about what happened when a son died without heirs, clauses about the military obligations that each brother owed the others. Charlemagne had it drafted like a contract, because that's what it was. He had something the document couldn't capture, though. He had 3 grown sons who'd come up inside the empire and understood how the machine actually worked. And within 4 years, the whole calculation shattered. Pepin died in 810. Charles the Younger died in 811. And that left Louis, the youngest, who'd been the man-made king of Aquitaine at the age of 3, as a kind of training exercise, as the last standing sons. Charlemagne died in 814, and Louis inherited everything. So the Divisio Reginorum just became a historical artifact, a plan that never actually ran. And Louis the Pious was now the emperor of the Romans, the king of the Franks, the sole ruler of the largest political entity in Western Europe. He was also a deeply serious man, religious right down to the core, surrounded by bishops who genuinely believed the empire had a sacred mission. And he immediately grasped the problem his father had died before solving. Because Louis had watched the Divisio Reginorum get drafted. He'd seen his father plan out a 3-way split, and then he'd watched his brothers die, one after another. And he understood something Charlemagne had only grasped too late, which was that partible inheritance at this scale was a weapon pointed straight at the empire itself. So Louis set out to change the law. He didn't do it loudly, and he didn't do it by abolishing the Frankish custom outright. He used the language his court respected most, which was the language of the church. In 817, he issued the Ordinatio Imperii, the ordering of the empire. And the logic was direct. The empire had a sacred mission. It existed to protect the church. It was, in a real sense, God's instrument on earth. And God's instrument couldn't be cut into pieces. So the Ordinatio Imperii established something like the Franks had never actually written down before. The principle that the empire was a single, indivisible unit. One crown, one authority, one heir. Louis's eldest son, Lothar, would inherit the whole thing. His other sons, Pepin and Louis the German, would get the kingdoms of their own, real authority over real territory, but always subordinate, always subject to Lothar, tributaries to the center. It was, in effect, a Carolingian run at primogeniture, and it almost worked. For about 3 years it held, and then Louis met Judith of Bavaria. Judith of Bavaria was young, educated, politically sharp, and completely committed to the future of her own children. Louis married her in 819, and then in 823 she gave birth to a son named Charles, the one history would call Charles the Bald. And the moment Charles was born, the Ordinatio Imperii had a problem. Louis now had a 4th son, and a son who wasn't written into the document at all, born after the contracts were signed and the oaths were sworn, and the whole arrangement was sealed. And under Frankish custom, that son had inheritance rights too. Louis loved the boy, and Judith was never going to be passive observer of her son's future. She worked the court. She lobbied the bishops. She got her allies into key administrative posts. And in 829, Louis revised the inheritance plan. He gave Charles, 6 years old at the time, the kingdom of Alemannia, territory carved right out of the empire, territory that previously sat under Lothar's authority. Lothar saw exactly what that meant, and so did his brothers. And so did every nobleman in the empire who'd sworn an oath to the Ordinatio Imperii. The emperor had just told all of them that the document meant nothing. What followed was the most destructive internal crisis in the Carolingian Empire that it ever went through. And it didn't come from the Vikings or from anything else outside the empire at all. It came from his own sons. In 830, Pepin and Lothar moved against their father, and Louis the German joined in. They captured him, and they forced him to undergo a public penance, a ritual humiliation designed to strip him of his political legitimacy. Because a king who'd done public penance had, in the eyes of the church, confessed to wrongdoing. He'd admitted his sins and acknowledged his failures. And a sinful king, they argued, had forfeited the right to rule at all. They tried to depose him, but it didn't hold. Louis's supporters rallied. The revolt collapsed, and Lothar got shipped off to Italy. And Louis the Pious was back on the throne. And then it happened all over again. In 833, all three of his sons moved at once. And this time, they had the Pope on their side, literally. Gregory IV crossed the Alps and turned up right there at the military standoff. Louis's army just dissolved. Men switched sides, and his support evaporated in a matter of days. He was captured, forced into a second public penance, and this one was more thorough, meant to look permanent. For a full year, Lothar ruled alone, and then Louis's support came drifting back. Pepin and Louis the German broke with Lothar over the settlement terms, and the whole coalition shattered. Louis the Pious was restored in 834, and he ruled until his death in 840. But the empire he died ruling wasn't the empire he'd inherited. Every rebellion required concessions, and every concession had transferred land and rights and revenue to local strongmen. And the counts who switched back in 833 had done it because switching sides was profitable, and they'd learned that that trick actually worked. Louis died on campaign against his son Louis the German. The latest round of the conflict had been running, with a few brief interruptions, for a decade. He died in June of 840, and the succession was wide open. 3 sons remained. There was Lothar I, the emperor, first among the heirs under the Ordinatio Imperii, the man holding the imperial title. There was Louis the German, king of Bavaria, the most capable soldier of all 3. And there was Charles the Bald, the youngest, the one whose birth had broken the original settlement in the first place, still building his base out in the western territories. There was also a 4th claimant in the mix. Pepin of Aquitaine had died back in 838, and his son, also named Pepin, was now pressing a claim to Aquitaine. A nephew rather than a son, but one with the Aquitanian nobility behind him. Lothar moved first. He had the imperial title, so he claimed the right to oversee the entire division as senior heir, and his brothers simply didn't accept it. Here's the thing you have to understand about Lothar. He wasn't actually wrong about his legal position. The Ordinatio Imperii still existed. His legal status as co-emperor and designated successor was completely real, but a title only functions when somebody can enforce it, and Louis the German and Charles the Bald were in no mood to be anybody's subordinate. So, through 840 and 841, the 3 sides maneuvered against each other. Alliances formed and broke, and the key monasteries, which controlled enormous agricultural revenues, got pledged to whoever happened to be winning that particular month. And then came Fontenoy, June the 25th, 841. The Battle of Fontenoy in Puisaye came down to what's now in Burgundy region of France. Louis the German and Charles the Bald had formed an alliance against Lothar, and Lothar backed by Pepin II of Aquitaine, and a large chunk of the Frankish nobility. They met them on the field. And what happened next, by 9th century standards, was an absolute slaughter. Frankish aristocrats, the exact men who made up the military backbone of the whole imperial system, killed each other in enormous numbers. Our best account comes from Nithard, who's worth pausing on for who he actually was. Nithard was Charlemagne's own grandson. He fought on Charles the Bold's side of the day at Fontenoy, and he was writing his history essentially in real time, at Charles's own request. He's an eyewitness and an interested party at the same time, a man justifying the winning side even as he records it. And what's striking is that even from inside the victorious camp, he can't make the battle feel like a victory. He writes about men he personally knew dying. He writes about the grief that came afterward. He describes a battle that felt wrong in the way that battles weren't supposed to feel. The Frankish aristocracy lost something at Fontenoy that they couldn't get back, which was the belief that the Carolingian Civil War was basically political theater with limited casualties. And this wasn't theater. Thousands of men died. The exact numbers lost to the sources. But the political effect was immediate. Nobody wanted to do that again. Lothar's army broke and he retreated. But winning didn't actually solve anything for Louis and Charles. If anything, it put a deadline on the problem. They needed a settlement, and they needed it fast, before Lothar could regroup, before the aristocracies on both sides lost patience, before the frontier lords, who were watching the Vikings raid the Seine and the Saracens hit the Mediterranean coast, decided that defending their own land mattered more than backing any emperor at all. February 842, Louis the German and Charles the Bald meet at Strasbourg. They needed to formalize their alliances publicly, bindingly, so they swore oaths to each other, and the oaths themselves were ordinary enough for the period. What was strange was the language they used. Louis the German swore his oath in an early form of French, the language Charles's troops spoke, and Charles the Bold swore his in High German, the language that Louis's men spoke. Each one was addressing the other in the brother's army directly, making it clear his commitment ran not just to his brother, but to the men who'd actually fight for his brother. The Oaths of Strasbourg are now mostly famous to linguists, because they're among the earliest surviving texts in something recognizable as French and something recognizable as German. But the political signal they sent mattered even more than the linguistic record. The eastern and western halves of the empire were already becoming different places, different speech, different social structures, different traditions of administration. The Frankish Empire had always governed in Latin. The documents were in Latin. The court ran on Latin. But underneath that administrative layer, two vernaculars had quietly diverged. And the lawyers who drafted the Verdun partition the following year were not going to miss that. A year after Strasbourg, it all came to a head. Lothar hadn't been destroyed at Fontenoy. He still held the imperial title. He still controlled the single largest block of the territory. But his brothers held enough military force to make continued war catastrophic for everyone. And the Frankish nobility, on all three sides, had made it clear that another Fontenoy was simply not acceptable. So a settlement got negotiated. And what happened at Verdun wasn't a diplomatic summit between three exhausted princes. It was a technical operation. Each side put together its own delegation. And these weren't mainly soldiers or nobles. They were church lawyers, notaries, financial administrators, royal estate managers, surveyors. They spent months at it, not days, months, taking inventory of the entire empire. They mapped out the fiscal revenues. They calculated what each region actually produced in taxation, and agricultural outputs, and military obligation. They mapped the ecclesiastical structure too. Which bishoprics reported to which archbishops, which monasteries controlled which lands, where the administrative circuits actually ran. They weren't just drawing lines on a map. They were working out what a fair share of the empire's fiscal base actually looked like, so that each piece came out to roughly equal in revenue, in administrative coherence, in military capacity, and then they drew the lines. The result was 3 kingdoms. Middle Francia went to Lothar. He kept the imperial title, though by this point it meant a great deal less than it had in 817. His territory ran from the Low Countries down through Burgundy, through Provence, and into northern and central Italy. It included Rome. It included Aachen, Charlemagne's own capital. East Francia went to Louis the German, roughly modern Germany east of the Rhine. So Bavaria, Saxony, Thuringia, Franconia. And West Francia went to Charles the Bald, roughly modern France west of the Rhone-Saône corridor, the Atlantic coast, and Aquitaine. The borders followed the rivers and mountain ranges, and the edges of the existing administrative units. They didn't follow ethnicity, because there were no clean ethnic boundaries to follow. They followed the fiscal survey. The lawyers had done their job too. And the partition had a structural weakness built right into it. Lothar's Middle Francia wasn't really a coherent unit at all. It was a corridor. It ran north to south for roughly 1,500 kilometers, from Francia, the coastal lowlands to the mouth of the Rhine, down to the Rhineland, through Burgundy, through Provence, into Lombardy and Rome. And that corridor had no natural center. There was no dominant city, no single agricultural base, no common language holding it together. The Rhine Valley and the Italian plains had almost nothing in common, except that both of them happened to be administered by Lothar. So when Lothar died in 855, he divided his territory among his own 3 sons, which is exactly what his grandfather had planned to do with Charlemagne's empire, and exactly what his father had spent his whole reign trying to prevent. Lothar II got the northern portion, roughly modern Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the Rhineland, and the region we now call Lorraine. That territory took his name, Lotharingia, Lorraine in French, Lotharingen in German. Charles of Provence got southern Burgundy and Provence. Louis II kept Italy and the nominal imperial title, and Lotharingia, that corridor between East and West Francia, was now its own separate unit. Then Lothar II died without legitimate heirs in 869, and East Francia and West Francia moved immediately to absorb it. The Treaty of Mersenne in 870 split Lotharingia between Louis the German and Charles the Bald. The Treaty of Ribemont in 880 adjusted the boundary again, and that strip of territory between Maas and the Rhine, the Moselle Valley, the Scheldt lowlands, and the Burgundian Plateau, became the single most contested border zone in Europe, and it stayed contested for over 1,000 years. Tom Holland, writing about exactly this era in his book Millennium, makes the point that the shape of medieval Europe was set less by any grand design than by any of these three accidents of the Carolingian inheritance. And the fault lines cracked open by the division of Charlemagne's world became the seams along which Europe would keep tearing itself apart for centuries. Alsace-Lorraine, the Low Countries, the Burgundian inheritance, northern Italy. Just about every major European war from the 10th century right up into the 20th traces its roots back to what the Treaty of Verdun left unresolved. The lawyers had drawn the lines, and the lines were wrong. Not wrong in 843, though. In 843, they were as precise as available tools allowed. They were wrong because the legal framework they applied, partible inheritance, equal to division, was built for a scale where splitting something produced two coherent pieces. At the scale of the Carolingian Empire, splitting it produced three pieces, and one of those three was never going to be viable. And here's the deeper consequence. Past the corridor problem, past the collapse of Lotharingia, by formalizing the division into an eastern half and a western half, the Treaty of Verdun set up preconditions for France and Germany to eventually exist as separate political identities. Not instantly and not cleanly, but over the century that followed Verdun, West Francia developed its own administrative institutions, its own royal lineage, its own relationship between crown and nobility. As Chris Wickham has argued, the real thing that split the Carolingian world apart was administration. What you had were two governing systems slowly diverging, two different ways of running the counts and the courts and the church. And that divergence was already happening long before anyone in either half thought of themselves as French or German. So the honest version of this has little to do with two nations discovering who they were, and a great deal to do with two bureaucracies quietly drifting apart. The Capetian dynasty that replaced the Carolingians in 987 inherited a West Frankish political structure that had been forming itself since 843, East Francia developing along a different track. Its kings had to manage a more fragmented nobility, a more contested eastern frontier, and a political structure that eventually produced the Holy Roman Empire. The two identities that finally emerged, French and German, were legal artifacts more than anything else, not ethnic facts sitting there waiting to be discovered. The partition created separate administrative units, and those units generated their own political processes over time, and those processes built up their own institutions, their own languages, their own relationship between ruler and ruled. So if France and Germany have a birthplace, it's a survey, not a battlefield. The men who calculated the fiscal yields and drew the ecclesiastical circuits in 843 thought they were doing estate planning. They were also, without having the faintest idea of it, doing nation building. And the men actually running those calculations were administrators, notaries, church lawyers, not kings. They were the same class of men who'd been designing estate settlements for Frankish chieftains for 300 years. And they just took those same tools and applied them to a continental empire. And the tools worked as designed, and that was precisely the problem. There's a figure in this story who doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's Wala of Corbie. He's a cousin of the Carolingians and a monk, eventually the Abbot of Corbie, which was one of the most important monasteries in the entire Frankish world, and he was also a political operative. During the civil wars of the 830s, Wala was one of the key architects of the rebellion against Louis the Pious. He rebuilt the legal and theological case for why Louis had violated the Ordinatio Imperii by revising it for Charles the Bald. He wrote the arguments. He organized the bishops. He worked the whole network. In modern terms, he was the lawyer for the opposition. And Wala stands for something that matters here. The men who manipulated the Carolingian succession were trained experts in Frankish law, not random opportunists grabbing whatever they could reach. They knew exactly which clauses to invoke, which precedents to cite, which rituals, like public penance, could be turned into weapons to strip away a king of his own legitimacy. None of this involved inventing new law. It was the law being applied correctly. And that correct application is what drove the fragmentation. The delegations at Verdun weren't doing anything corrupt or disloyal. They were carrying out a fair division with the best instruments they had. And those instruments were the problem. Partible inheritance, applied with real precision to a continental empire, produced a continental fracture. And it came out of expertise, out of people who were extremely good at their jobs. Then there's Hincmar of Reims, the Archbishop of Reims from 845 to 882, the single most powerful churchman in West Francia after Verdun. And Hincmar represents a single layer of what the partition created. Because once the empire was divided, authority inside each piece became immediately contested. Was the king supreme with his own kingdom? Were the bishops? Did the Pope have the authority to override the local king? Hincmar spent his whole career building the argument that the church, specifically the archbishop, held the power to crown a king and the power to constrain him. He wrote the coronation ritual for Charles the Bald. He designed the ceremonies. He controlled the story that people told about where the royal power actually came from. He was doing the same thing Wala had done, using expertise, theological and legal and liturgical, to shape political outcomes. So the fragmentation of the empire hadn't just produced 3 kingdoms. It had produced 3 kingdoms where the king's authority was suddenly uncertain, because the emperor had been the keystone of the whole thing. Take out the emperor, take out the keystone, and every structure resting on top of it starts to shift. The bishops, the courts, the counts, the local strongman all moved into the space that the empire used to fill. And none of it happened through violence. It happened through administration, through charters and privileges and legal arguments about what the king had granted and what he hadn't. It's the same process as before, just with different people running it. And this pattern doesn't belong to just the 9th century. It belongs to any large organization whose legal framework was designed for a smaller version of itself. Take a family-owned business. 3rd generation in. The grandfather built it from nothing. The father ran it. And now there are 8 grandchildren, each with its own legal claim. The lawyers come in, and they've got no interest in destroying the business. They want to carry out a fair division, equal shares, equal value, professionally audited. And what comes out the other side is 8 minority stakeholders, not one of whom has enough to control actually anything at all. And the company that spends more on shareholder disputes than it does on operations. The tool worked perfectly. It was the application that destroyed the thing it was applied to. And this is the part where it's worth remembering that a version of this idea is very old. Centuries after Verdun, the historian Ibn Khaldun sat and watched dynasties rise and fall across North Africa. And he put a name to the pattern. The founders have the hunger and the cohesion to build something. And by the 3rd or 4th generation, that cohesion dissolves. And the heirs inherit the wealth and the titles, but not the thing that actually held it together. Now, he was describing tribes and dynasties, not Frankish estate law. But the underlying shape is the same one that we've been tracing. What one generation concentrates through sheer will of force, the next generation divides by rule. And the division is what kills it. And this is not some rare case. It runs straight through the Habsburg succession in 1556. Charles split the empire between his son Philip II, who got Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, the Americas, and his brother Ferdinand got the Austrian lands and the imperial title. It was clean and legal and perfectly logical. And what it produced was a century of European war over where the line between the two halves actually ran. But look at the partition of Poland in the 18th century. 3 neighboring powers, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, divided up the state legally, using treaties, precise, documented, and internationally recognized. And Poland disappeared off the map for 123 years. The tools worked, the application was catastrophic. Same playbook, just a different century. So here's the underlying model. Large systems, whether they're empires or corporations or political dynasties, built by individuals who concentrate authority. They work because of that concentration. The system is coherent because one point is holding everything together. And by law, and by its very design, it can't accommodate that concentration across generation. Because the law is built for distribution, for fairness, for spreading an inheritance out. So when the builder dies, the lawyers come in and apply the law. And the law works, and the system comes apart. And again, it comes apart through precision, through people doing the job exactly right. Charlemagne's empire didn't fall to the Vikings or to the Saracens, and it didn't buckle under the weight of its own geography either. It was dismantled by teams of Frankish lawyers and notaries and surveyors and church administrators who spent months in 843 calculating fiscal revenues and drawing lines on a map. They did exactly what they'd been trained to do. It took Frankish partible inheritance, a legal framework built for chieftain estates, and applied it to a continental empire. And it worked. The seals were stamped. The document was signed. The empire became 3 kingdoms. And those 3 kingdoms slowly became the map of modern Europe. Verdun didn't end history. If anything, it wrote a big part of it. Just about every border dispute, every dynastic war, every argument over Alsace or Burgundy or the Low Countries or Lombardy for the next 12 centuries traces back to a room in 843 where the lawyers were quietly doing their jobs. And this is what hidden forces actually look like. People hear a phrase like that and they picture a conspiracy, some secret meeting in a back room. What's really going on is a lot quieter than that. It's a legal framework, doing exactly what it was built to do, at a scale it was never built for. That's how empires end, and it's how they get rebuilt too, in smaller pieces by the men who controlled the paperwork. The lawyers were always in the room. They still are. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.